Well, good evening. We have 35 here we call it the studio, but it's wonderful. So thank you so much for coming. Ethan has just been coming downstairs in the elevator. It's wonderful to see so many. And welcome those of you who are on Zoom. I have just one announcement which I'd like to make, but it's an offer to our members. I was given copies of a book, leaflet, called Yankees and Loyalists, which is now, I've got a dozen or so copies available to those who are interested. It's a diary written in 1830 by a man who lived in what was then Bytown, Ottawa, who heard that there was a bank opening in Kingston. And he wanted to buy shares in the bank, but the only people who could buy shares were those who turned up at the counter and gave their money. So he walked down from Bytown. He followed the Rideau, which was not yet a canal, so a lot of it was across country. He saw some of the dams being built, some of the waterways being opened, and I won't tell you the end of the story. But if you're interested in having a copy of this, do ask me. I've got a limited number, and it's a most interesting read. I think at this point, that's the only announcement I have. Duncan, hand it over to you.
Good evening. I'm Duncan McDowell, the program chair for the Society, and I want to welcome you to our fourth spring lecture. It's my pleasure this afternoon or this evening to introduce Dr. Sandy Campbell, our speaker. Sandy comes to us from a long career as a professor of Canadian literature and women's studies at McGill, the University of Ottawa, Carleton, and Bermuda College. Most recently, she has served as a professor of women's and gender studies at the Pauline Jewett Center at Carleton University. Through her career, she's had many publications. She's been the general editor of the Borealis Press's early Canadian women writers series, so-called New Women of the beginning of the 20th century. She's been a biographer of Lauren Pierce, the great Canadian publisher and Queen's graduate who ran Ryerson Press for many decades. That book was published under the title of Both Hands, a salute to his Methodist vigor, published by McGill Queen's Press. She's been very active in writing articles and lecturing on many subjects, perhaps most closely to her heart, Bermuda history and heritage, where she spends much time and was also a scholar in residence there. Most particularly, she has concentrated on the publishing of slave narratives. Slaves were, as you can imagine, largely illiterate. It took somebody, usually white and usually abolitionist, to capture their experiences as a slave and publish them in the early to mid-19th century as it were propaganda for the end of slavery. So Sandy has been very active in that, carrying that message both to Bermuda and also down into the West Indies. So she's had a very varied career and a very productive one. So in the spirit, I suppose, of full disclosure, I should confess that she's also my wife. So it's a double pleasure to be here tonight to introduce her in this light. And she has an inveterate curiosity. And that curiosity has led her to the doorstep of this very interesting story tonight that is focused on our own town of Kingston. And you might call her a new woman of the early 20th century, whose story she will chronicle tonight. Sandy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Duncan. Everyone can hear me? Good. I'd like to begin this evening by offering some thanks, first of all, to the Kingston Historical Society, to Paul Van Ness, who's the digital impresario, which is no mean feat, to Peter Gower, the president, but who also edits the journal, and I think will be massaging my prose in short order. And of course, to the program chair, Duncan McDowell, who not only introduced me, but prodded me diligently at all routes along and read the manuscript for me. I'm also thanking, and I think all of us in Kingston owe a debt to them, the Queen's Archives, in this case, particularly Deirdre Bryden, because I did rely on one collection, the fawns of the late Rick O'Neill, and she was a great help. And John Haynes is here tonight. He's married to one of my childhood friends, and research, they say, uncovers new vistas. And we've known John for decades and decades. We had no idea that his grandfather was on the Lusitania and survived. And not because he was rooming with two clergymen, because one of them drowned. So he was obviously an estimable gentleman, and we're grateful that John is here with us today as a result. I'd also like to thank the Saranac Lake Free Library, which preserves the Trudeau Laboratory as a museum. They were very helpful to me, and the Saranac Lake Free Library. When political things, Duncan and I are tuberculosis buffs, and when political atmosphere is once more intact, we'll certainly be making our Umpty Dumps trip to Saranac Lake. And I might say this paper came out of, as so often does, just a little tweak, a little notice. There was mention in a magazine, that a tourist magazine, that a Canadian woman named Kathleen Hammond, who'd been on the Lusitania, had also been in Saranac Lake. And so it was from there that we started digging, and this paper is the result. Now, I must say that the details of the Lusitania sinking are so harrowing that I wondered if I should issue you with life jackets to listen to this. But we'll see what this story unfolds. So tonight, my topic is Kingston's Kathleen Hammond, the Lusitania, and the White Plague. And what I first want to think about is, what is the trajectory of a life? How do larger forces impact an individual life? How does the unexpected warp the course of life? Tonight, I want to share with you the story of an early 20th century Kingston woman, Kathleen Saunders McParland Hammond, born in 1885, died in 1919. She was born into wealth and privilege, yet her life was tragically altered by war and disease. So here's her story, its dramatic essentials gleaned from newspapers and digital research, because I started with her name and the fact that she was from Kingston. In September 1898, the Kingston Daily Standard carried the account of a dramatic incident in the waters of the Thousand Islands at Gananoque. Off Tremont Park Island, a summer retreat for Gananoque's well-to-do, a sailing skiff capsized. The lone male occupant could not swim. The Standard caught the drama of the incident. Quote, one of his feet caught in the lining of the boat, and for some time he was unable to free it. He clung to the boat and called for help. His niece, Miss Kathleen McParland, who reached him first, conveyed him ashore. Miss McParland was completely exhausted after her plucky effort. Well, 13-year-old Kathleen was not only plucky, she was privileged. She was the daughter of James McParland, born in 1849, died in 1922, and his wife, Mary Ann Coleman. James McParland, born in Brockville in 1849, had prospered, first in business in Gananoque and then in Kingston. An Irish Catholic success story in Eastern Ontario, he'd started out with a photographic business in Gananoque in the 1870s, soon getting into the grocery business there, including tobacco and alcohol sales, while dabbling in sidelines like steamship agency and telephone pole contracting. And there you see the real source of his life, wealth. By 1887, when Kathleen was 2, he had moved to Kingston, establishing a business, at 341 King Street, centered on the wholesale wine and liquor trade. And advertisements for McParland J Wines and Liquors were featured in the local press. And there's one of the jugs there, which I found in a collector's website. In short, James McParland was becoming a wealthy man with wide business interests, and they were suitably awed in his old town of Gananoque because the rumor spread that even his cottage had gold-plated plumbing taps. Not true, of course, but I think it shows this kind of feeling that he'd made it. By 1901, he, his wife, and their family of 2 sons, James Frederick Jr. and Arthur, 2 daughters, Gertrude and younger sister Kathleen, had moved successively from 106 Bagot Street and 165 King Street to one of Kingston's premier addresses at 3 Emily Street, a large and imposing stone duplex on the Lake Ontario shore just below King Street overlooking McDonald Park. I'm sure most of you know it by sight, right across from the gazebo. McParland christened it Innisfail. The McParlands joined a tight circle of wealthy entrepreneurial Irish families in Kingston. For example, just across the park from their handsome Emily Street residence lived Cornelius Birmingham, owner of the local locomotive works and a prominent fixture in the Catholic society focused on St. Mary's Cathedral. And as part of Kingston's Roman Catholic elite, Mary Ann McParland and her 2 daughters frequently appeared in the social columns of Kingston's newspapers, the Big, the Standard, and the Daily News. In 1896, Whig readers learned that 10-year-old Kathleen had played a fairy in the Notre Dame Convent School production of the operetta Tyrolean Queen, the first stirrings of what would prove to be her lifelong musical talent. And we'll encounter that talent later. A year later, Mrs. McParland hosted a large fundraising tea for the Ladies' Aid of St. Mary's Cathedral at her spacious home. Kathleen and a friend, quote, conducted the flower table and supplied fragrant roses and pinks at a small cost. Even in girlhood, Kathleen's horizons soon broadened beyond Kingston. In the fall of 1900, 15-year-old Kathleen was sent to Toronto to study at the fashionable Loreto Abbey private girls' school with its wider social context. Transatlantic travel was next. At 19, Kathleen and her mother sailed from New York on the SS Baltic just after Christmas 1904. The Whig social columnist reported breathlessly, "They will go to London, where they will spend a few days and will then leave for the continent, spending the winter in the south of France and in Italy. On their return, they will spend some time in England, Ireland, and Scotland." Kathleen must have liked Europe. 3 years later, in November 1907, she sailed for London and Paris, traveling with family friends in a 10-month grand tour that included Egypt and the Riviera, capped by a summer of visiting the prettiest spots in the mother country after her mother had joined her that spring. By this time, the winsome, pretty young woman, soft-spoken, slender, fair-haired, and brown-eyed, was being singled out for her grace and her fashionable wardrobe. A Whig account of a Kingston City Hall dance remarked on her, quote, beautiful frock of bronze sequins. Both Kathleen's wardrobe and the McParland family's social prominence received a boost when her elder sister Gertrude married Lieutenant Colonel Edward Kennedy of Halifax 66th Prince of Wales Fusiliers in June 1907, a few months before Kathleen's second continental tour. The groom, a Northwest Rebellion veteran considerably older than his bride, was the scion of a prominent Halifax mercantile and banking family. Thomas Kenny of the Merchants' Bank of Halifax, his ancestors, had been a father of Confederation. The large McParland-Kenny wedding, presided over by the Archbishop of Kingston, made the Montreal and Toronto papers with details of the ceremony at St. Mary's Cathedral and wedding breakfast at Emily Street. In an era when marriage was seen as the desirable destiny for upper-class young women, Kathleen was not long in following her sister's path. 2 years later, on the 30th of September, 1909, she married Torontonian Frederick Sidney Hammond. And I want you to notice the fashion details in here too. Look at those shoes, those splendid shoes. The dark-haired, boyish Hammond, who at 24 was the same age as Kathleen, was undoubtedly considered a catch by the society columnists. Frederick's father, Herbert C. Hammond, had been a very successful Toronto broker and investor with interests in shipping, banking, and mining during the economic boom of the Laurier years. Mount Hammond, a peak in British Columbia's Windermere Valley, where he had mining interests, is named for him. The elder Hammond had died a few months before Kathleen and Frederick's wedding, leaving a large fortune to Frederick and his younger brother Herbert. Indeed, a week before the nuptials, Fred Hammond made a marriage settlement of some $90,000 to Kathleen, a fabulous sum in that era, which must have reassured her father about the groom's good intentions. In fact, the McParlands and the Hammonds had been very friendly for some time. Herbert Hammond and his wife Fanny had been the who chaperoned Kathleen on her second voyage to Europe in 1907. Young Frederick had been an usher at Gertrude McParland's wedding that year. Given his status as second-generation wealth, Frederick's primary passion seemed to have been equestrian, playing polo and membership in the Toronto Hunt Club, rather than amassing yet more wealth as a broker. The wedding at St. Mary's Cathedral was lavish, with lengthy newspaper accounts of the, quote, bright little brides, and you can see these stereotypes of women operating in these write-ups. The bright little bride's Parisian lace wedding gown, her many attendants, and her pearl and diamond necklet and matching earrings, a gift to the groom. After the Emily Street wedding breakfast, the Daily Standard reported that Kathleen, in gold embroidered silk with a rose velvet turban, and her new groom, quote, left on the train for Quebec, whence they will sail on Saturday on the SS Laurentic for England, and later they will take their motor car and travel through Italy, France, Austria, and Germany. It sounds like one of those classic travel posters. They will return to their beautiful new home in Toronto about Christmas. That new home was, of course, in a fashionable district of Toronto, on Grosvenor Avenue, east of Queen's Park. The new Mrs. Hammond was soon prominent in the Toronto Society columns, for example, as one of the patronesses of the tea room at the Toronto Horse Show, in company with Lady Pellet of Casaloma. When a dance for 200 was held at Benvenuto, the showplace estate of capitalist and railroad magnate William Mackenzie, Kathleen was described as, quote, one of the loveliest women in the room. But about this time, Kathleen's life began to darken as the gilded couple faced major sorrow and loss. On the 21st November 1910, a stark one-sentence announcement in the Toronto Star recorded the death of their infant son, Paul Carlisle Hammond, 2 days earlier. Whatever the cause of the baby's death, Kathleen and Fred Hammond would have no more children. In the wake of this sorrow, the chronicle of their social lives increasingly became one of seemingly restless travel. Montreal, Vancouver, Kingston, Halifax, where Kathleen's sister Gertrude was suddenly widowed less than a year after the death of the Hammond baby. Then, sometime in 1913, the Hammonds sailed to Europe for a long sojourn, only returning as the shadow of World War I loomed over the Western world. Arriving in New York at the end of January 1914 en route to Canada, the couple gave their Toronto address as the York Club. Once again, excuse me, the mentions of them in the social columns suggest restlessness. Visits to the family in Kingston, but also travel to Vancouver, Montreal, the eastern townships, the Thousand Islands. Kathleen seems to have been in Kingston, or more probably at the Tremont Park cottage, with its putative gold-plated taps, no doubt, with her family when World War I broke out in August 1914. As the war took hold, a new focus for the couple's life began to emerge. 29-year-old Fred Hammond was young, fit, patriotic, horsey, rich, and well-connected. Why not enlist in the most prestigious manner to boot? Frederick's values were those of the Anglo-military caste in Canadian society, always keen to demonstrate its Britishness. Frederick's Toronto friend, Sir Henry Pellet, epitomized this strain of sentiment. The Hammonds had already spent considerable time in England. For example, Frederick seems to have made a will with a London solicitor sometime before their return to America in early 1914. Optimism was still in the air about the war, with many people in Britain and the Empire believing that it would be a glorious crusade and that victory would come quickly. Amid all this upbeat patriotism, Frederick resolved to enlist in a manner befitting his station, i.e., using his social contacts to serve not in a Canadian contingent, but in a hallowed British regiment, preferably a cavalry one, to make use of his equestrian skills. Kathleen, like a number of upper-class Canadian wives, would accompany him to London, where she undoubtedly hoped to do Red Cross or other volunteer war work, like many others of her kind. By the spring of 1915, the couple set out to do just that. In an April farewell letter from Ottawa to a relative, Fred revealed that he was seeing no less a personage than the Governor General, the Duke of Connaught, a son of Queen Victoria, to seek vice-regal patronage for his martial ambitions. The letter exudes confidence, and this is one moment when we actually hear his voice. I'm certain of a good commission, I feel sure. Connaught has given me an appointment this afternoon and has promised me letters to England. That means if I want to go infantry, I can get into either the Grenadier Guards or Rifle Brigade. Couldn't do much better than that, could I? But I think I'll try for a cavalry job. Always those horses. Hammond added, quote, Kath is in Kingston saying goodbye to her people. He ended the letter by saying, I hope I'll get safely back again. Fate, however, had other plans for him. The German enemy would strike at him, not on the battlefields of Northern Europe, but in the chilly Atlantic waters off Ireland before he could ever reach England or don a military uniform. How did this happen? Fatefully, the ship that the Hammonds had booked passage on to sail from New York to London was Cunard's majestic RMS Lusitania. Launched in 1906, the 31,000-ton four-funnel British liner, there it is, was one of the largest, fastest, and most luxurious liners afloat, with capacity for a crew of 850 and 2,198 passengers, 552 of them in first class. First-class passengers enjoyed the exclusive run of no less than 5 of the ship's 6 decks, their posh quarters located in the center of the ship. First-class accommodations were lavish, with vaulted skylights in the common areas, decorative plasterwork accented by marble, crystal, and gilt, painted frescoes in the dining room, and fittings of mahogany, silk, and velvet throughout the first-class area. What the ship did not have, however, was a full complement of lifeboats. The belief being that rescue ships could be counted on to arrive in a timely fashion in any disaster, a somewhat incredible assumption given the fate of the Titanic 3 years earlier. And you may remember the anniversary of that sinking was yesterday. Ironically, Kathleen had been a passenger on the Lusitania before. She and Frederick's parents had sailed to England on her in the fall of 1907 on one of the liner's very early, much-touted transatlantic crossings. But this voyage was different, undertaken in troubled times. As the war between Germany and the Allies deepened, the danger to civilian as well as military vessels increased. By February 1915, the area along the Irish and British coasts had been declared a military zone by the German government, with any Allied shipping declared a possible target to be sunk without warning. It is worth remembering that World War I cruelly carried the harm of war to civilian populations in ways, or to a degree, conflict had seldom done before. Submarines were an instrument of such terror. So-called cruiser rules, which meant that the attackers would theoretically allow evacuation of crew and passengers before sinking a civilian ship, would no longer apply. In her last few voyages, before the fateful one, the Lusitania had taken some precautions, including flying the U.S. flag, because at that time it was a neutral flag, as America did not enter the war until April 1917. Now, it flew that flag in the war zone, presumably because there were numerous U.S. citizens aboard, a strategy unlikely to deter the enemy. Indeed, ominously, the German embassy in the United States had taken out ads in 50 U.S. newspapers in April 1915, warning, quote, travelers embarking on the transatlantic voyage that ships belonging to Britain and her allies were, quote, liable to destruction in the waters off the British Isles. The ad, in fact, ran in New York newspapers on the 1st of May. Excuse me. The very day the Lusitania, under the command of Captain William Turner, sailed from Pier 54. Undeterred by the threat, Frederick and Kathleen were aboard, getting settled in cabin B89. In fact, first class was so full that Frederick's half-sister and her family had been unable to book passage. The passenger list glittered with the rich and famous. There was a Vanderbilt on board, and Lieutenant James Dunsmuir, Jr., the young officer's son of the BC mining magnate and politician James Dunsmuir, who knew the Hammonds. Both would perish. The president of one of Canada's largest companies, Frederick Pearson of Brazilian Traction, was also on board, and he would have been the talk of many wealthy passengers. He perished, and perhaps in question period, Duncan will tell you a little bit about him. One suspects that despite the warnings, would-be passengers resisted the idea that the Germans would be willing to sink such a large, fast civilian ship, particularly one carrying nearly 200 citizens of neutral America. Tellingly, Frederick had not even referred to such a possibility in his letters to his half-brother a few days before departure. Now, shipboard social life in first class was a congenial and gracious affair in the vaulted dining room, in the elegant lounges, and among the capacious deck chairs. It was a pleasant and soothing routine that the sophisticated Hammonds and their fellow saloon passengers knew well. By midday on Friday, the 7th of May, the Lusitania was about 16 hours from her destination at the port of Liverpool. She was steaming along at 18 knots, not her top speed, that was about 22, some 18 kilometers off Ireland's old Head of Kinsale. And she was going several knots slower than her top speed to calibrate her arrival in Liverpool with high tide in the Mersey, because it was easier to get the ship into port. The heavy fog of the morning had cleared. The sky was blue, the sea was calm. Beautiful weather for strolling the deck, but also ideal conditions for submarine attack. Captain Turner had been given some intimations of enemy submarine activity, and the day before, he had ordered the Lusitania's lifeboats uncovered and swung out. However, as was Cunard practice, there had been no lifeboat or life jacket drill for the passengers on the voyage. The British authorities, for their part, had provided no escort for the ship. At 2:10 p.m., just as first class was finishing a splendid lunch, the unthinkable happened. German U-boat SMU-20, under the command of Captain Walter Schwieger, which had been attacking Allied shipping in the vicinity in the previous days, had spotted the Lusitania shortly before. Schwieger later claimed not to have recognized the ship, but given her distinctive four-funnel profile, this was highly unlikely. U-20 fired a single torpedo which struck Lusitania in the starboard bow below the waterline just behind the bridge. The huge explosion of 350 pounds of TNT in the projectile was followed by a second smaller explosion, perhaps from an exploding boiler or from coal dust in the coal bins for the engines. A Niagara of seawater poured into the enormous hole, 40 feet wide and 15 feet high, created by the torpedo blast. The influx of water intensified by the speed of the ship. Because, of course, because it was going at speed when it was hit, it kept on moving forward even as the sinking progressed. The ship would sink in just 18 minutes. I found that such a chilling detail. And after impact, she would rapidly list 30 degrees to starboard, meaning that the lifeboats on that side swung out an unwieldy 5 to 8 feet from the deck, 60 feet above the water. That rendered them virtually inaccessible, the more so since many of the crew had been below decks in the baggage hold when the torpedo struck, shifting the baggage for the ship's arrival in Liverpool. Most of these sailors were killed instantly when the torpedo struck. Many passengers who tried to bridge the gap to get into the lifeboats on the starboard side tumbled into the waters far below. Those who threw deck chairs or the like into the sea as makeshift flotation devices and jumped off after them found them already out of reach because of the speed at which the ship was moving, even as it sank. Several lifeboats overturned when they hit the water. In the end, only 6 of the ship's 48 lifeboats were launched successfully, and of the 1,959 passengers and crew aboard, only 764 survived the sinking. And we see a photo of the mass burial. What happened to the Hammonds in this scene of chaos, screams, and watery death? The couple would probably have been in or near the dining room, with Kathleen elegantly dressed and the two anticipating the arrival in England near at hand. Minutes later, Kathleen was in the sea, her clothes sodden with salt water. Did she fall? Did she jump? Was she ejected from one of the overturned lifeboats? We don't know. But we do know that she was wearing a life belt, and it seems the reporting is a bit garbled that she may have taken it out of one of the lifeboats that was not operational, and she would need it. She was a good swimmer. We know that from her rescue of her uncle from the waters of the St. Lawrence so long ago. She would need all her stamina. The water was frigid, some 12 degrees Celsius. The sea was scattered with debris from the sinking, debris churned up by the sinking ship as passengers screamed for help. At some point, a piece of debris slammed into Kathleen's forehead, opening a bloody gash. She lost consciousness. She was in the water for 4 grim hours, long after the liner disappeared beneath the waves. In the grisly aftermath, Irish boats of all sorts had come out to rescue survivors. Kathleen later recounted that she was taken for dead when she was at last dragged out of the water. Drenched and injured, she, quote, recovered consciousness to find herself lying on some boards, a sailor's coat thrown over her, and hearing someone saying, "Why, this woman's alive. What of Fred?" Fred Hammond was initially thought to have survived, but it was a heartbreaking case of mistaken identity. There was another couple named Hammond in first class. Ogden Hammond, a New Jersey state senator and real estate developer, and his wife Mary. The New Jersey Hammonds fell, life jacketless, out of a mislaunched lifeboat into the sea. Ogden resurfaced and clung to a floating oar to be rescued by the Flying Fish, an Irish side wheeler. His wife did not resurface. But in the confusion of the aftermath, Kathleen was assured that her husband had been rescued and Ogden Hammond was told that his wife had been saved, but in fact, each had lost their mates. Fred Hammond was gone beneath the waves, and his body was never recovered. Life had dealt Kathleen a cruel stroke of fate. The torpedoing of the Lusitania caused widespread shock, outrage, and ill feeling against Germany, particularly in North America and Britain. It was a factor in the United States' entry into the war 2 years later. More immediately, when news of the sinking came to the McParland residence on Emily Street, James McParland swung into action. He enlisted a London friend, Harold de Pass, to travel to Ireland to investigate the fate of the Hammonds and of family friends like young Dunsmuir. Cruelly, the mix-up of the Hammond couples was apparently repeated in the first reports received by Kathleen's parents. Reporters, of course, were at the door of Emily Street. On the 10th of May, the Kingston Whig mistakenly reported that both Hammonds had survived, an error they had to correct the next day. Over in Ireland, Harold de Pass had the grim task of inspecting scores of bodies recovered from the sinking, desperately trying to locate and identify Hammond or Dunsmuir. Futile. Like Hammond's body, Dunsmuir's was gone forever. 2 of the 600 passengers whose corpses were never recovered. No wonder Kathleen, now being treated in a nursing home in Cork, was described as suffering from, quote, nervous shock, as well as the head injury. From Kingston, James McParland directed his de Pass to take his traumatized daughter back to London after about 10 days in the nursing home. Gertrude Kenny, Kathleen's widowed sister, rushed to her injured sister's side, sailing from New York on the St. Louis on the 18th of May, a voyage that must have strained the nerves. In July, the Kingston papers reported that Kathleen was, quote, recovering slowly from the shock of the Lusitania disaster. This is a portrait made, I think, a little bit later, but I think in widowhood, of Kathleen. Little wonder. In addition to the trauma, whose effects were poorly understood in the early 20th century, later photographs suggest that she was left with a jagged scar on her forehead. And you'll notice you can't really see her forehead. And when I show you a press clipping with another image of Kathleen, you'll see that her hair is strategically arranged so that you can't really see her forehead. The torpedoing would have been brought back to the young widow every time she looked in the mirror. She'd been scarred by war, one of the mythical 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Another horseman would soon bear down on her. There would be no happy ending. She would, however, have one pleasant interlude in the brief time left to her. Kathleen stayed in London for the rest of the war. Bereavement and injury initially curtailed her social life, and she would never again be in robust health. Working on tuberculosis gives you a cough. The prospect of another wartime voyage across the Atlantic must have been terrifying, and she did not attempt it. However, she knew London well, with its large circle of well-to-do Canadian women doing war work as their male relatives fought the Germans. Not only did her sister initially come to London to support her, her older brother, Major James Frederick McParland, an RMC grad, was also overseas, serving with the Princess of Wales' own regiment. With 2 Canadian women friends, Kathleen rented a seaside house in Folkestone near Dover on the English coast in late December 1915 for the winter. Traditionally a favorite area for those in need of rest and recuperation. The next December, Kathleen's parents sailed from New York to visit Kathleen and her officer brother. Kathleen's happy interlude came in May 1917, 2 years after the sinking. In London, she'd recovered sufficiently to take some part in fundraising for war charities, thereby carrying on the plan for herself that she and Frederick had made before his death. The sizable Canadian contingent of socially prominent women in London for the duration was centered around Montreal's Lady Drummond, who headed the Red Cross office in London. One beneficiary of Red Cross support was St. Dunstan's Hospital for Blinded Soldiers in Regent's Park, which sheltered and retrained those blinded in action, including Canadian soldiers and sailors. A group of prominent Canadian women, Kathleen among them, funded and staged a musical revue called Hello Canada at His Majesty's Theatre to raise money for St. Dunstan's. There was a link with the Lusitania in this theatrical endeavor, which must have meant something to Kathleen. Two other prime movers in staging the fundraiser were two sisters of Lieutenant Dunsmuir, who had been lost with Frederick Hammond. The musical revue was a glittering affair. King George V and Queen Mary were patrons, and Queen Alexandra, the Queen Mother, was in attendance at the matinee event, as was a contingent of wounded Canadian soldiers. The light-hearted production featured the adventures of two young Englishmen visiting Canada and featured a Montreal ball as well as a train journey to the west. There was one scene in a Pullman car, with other scenes of cowboys and haymaking to amuse the bejeweled spectators. Attendees opened their wallets, and over £1,200 was raised for the St. Dunstan's Hospital, a substantial sum. The English and Canadian coverage was enthusiastic. Kathleen's musical gifts were much praised. It was her moment in the limelight for her talent and her charitable instincts. According to the Toronto Star Weekly's Canadian correspondent in London, Kathleen had written the music and part of the dialogue. Quote, Mrs. Hammond has shown almost a genius of musical talent and has given us some attractive melodies of useful lyrical quality, which will doubtless prove popular airs. The Star Weekly story featured three elegant individual portraits of Kathleen and the Dunsmuir sisters. You see it there. Now, you see Kathleen is leaning forward, and you see the way her hair is arranged. You can't really see her forehead well. Kathleen was thin but smiling in widow's black. For its part, England's Daily Telegraph singled out, quote, the brightness and rhythmical charm of Mrs. Frederick Hammond's music, calling it, quote, a particularly pleasing feature of the afternoon. Sadly, however, the shadow of the Lusitania had incubated a shadow on Kathleen's lungs. That is to say, a tragedy of war had brought in its wake disease, another apocalyptic horseman. Sometime in the period after her rescue from the sea, she developed tuberculosis. The fact that her elderly parents braved the wartime ocean in the winter of 1916 to visit their daughter in London suggests that all was not well with Kathleen. Tuberculosis, also called by the sinister names consumption and the White Death or the White Plague, was a widespread, feared, and stigmatized disease in the early 20th century, and for good reason. In the 19th century, 25% of deaths in the Western world were attributed to TB. Death was usually a drawn-out affair characterized by coughing, bloody sputum, weakness, fever, respiratory decline, and weight loss, among other effects. The deadly bacillus could attack the lungs and many other parts of the body. The disease is infectious, being spread by sneezing, coughing, sputum, and the like, especially in poorly ventilated environments. Its origins in humans date back to prehistoric times, and it was rampant before an effective antibiotic was developed in the 1950s. Today, of course, in the West, drug-resistant tuberculosis has become a problem, and tuberculosis is still a killer in part of the world. In Kathleen's time, the best hope for recovery was prolonged and strictly enforced rest and fresh air in a medical sanatorium, preferably in the dry, crisp air of a mountainous setting like the Swiss Alps, the Rocky Mountains, or the Adirondacks. But the odds were grim, even at that. In 1916, mortality rates in some sanatoria were calculated at 50%. One account of Kathleen's life implies that she contracted TB because of her watery ordeal in the sinking of the Lusitania. The reality is more complex. Tuberculosis does not develop overnight, and the bacillus can be latent in the system for long periods after exposure, becoming active at times when the host's immune system is compromised. I suspect that Kathleen may have been exposed to the bacillus earlier, possibly from someone in her husband's family. Why do I think that? Well, her late father-in-law, Herbert Hammond, had been a major donor to tuberculosis causes, including playing a key role in the establishment in 1907 of the Weston Sanatorium near Toronto. His devotion to the cause suggests a Hammond familial history of the disease, and we know that Kathleen knew and traveled with the Hammond family from well before her marriage. In any case, however and whenever Kathleen acquired the bacillus, the ordeal of the sinking would undoubtedly have left her immune system vulnerable, opening the way for the bacillus to proliferate in her body, with unmistakable symptoms only being apparent when the infection was advanced. In the grip of the stigmatized illness, which of course would not be spoken of publicly, Kathleen Hammond returned to Canada in 1919 after 4 long years on a foreign shore. In June 1919, the newspapers reported that Kathleen had sailed for Canada in the company of her officer brother, now Lieutenant Colonel McParland, and his family, to be met in Montreal by her sister Gertrude. If she returned to Kingston at all, it was only briefly. She was undoubtedly very ill at this point, and her only hope of recovery, however slim, lay a half-day's journey south of Kingston in Saranac Lake, New York, nestled in the Adirondack Mountains, the premier health resort in North America for TB treatment. And this is a contemporary photograph, contemporary to her, actually. In 1919, Saranac Lake was famous as a treatment center for, quote, health seekers, as tuberculosis patients were euphemistically called. The mountain village of some 7,000 was the location of the renowned Trudeau Sanatorium, founded in 1882 by New York City physician Dr. Edward Trudeau, a relative actually of Pierre and Justin Trudeau, and the grandfather of the Doonesbury Trudeau of fame. Dr. Trudeau, in the wake of the theorizing of some European physicians, credited a rest cure in the cold, clear mountain air with arresting the progress of his own tuberculosis on a sojourn there a decade earlier. Tubercular patients, desperate for a chance at recovery, soon flocked to the mountain village and its environs. The Adirondack Cottage Hospital, as it was formerly known, did not take paying patients, but the village soon became dotted with cure cottages, nursing homes and houses created for those able to underwrite the cost of private nursing and the possibility of long months and years of enforced rest. It is estimated that some 60,000 patients came to be treated in cure cottage or sanatorium in Little Saranac Lake between 1887 and 1950. And here's a group of patients at the Trudeau Sanatorium, and I want you to notice the cure chairs that they're in, because an important part of the cure was sitting out on unheated porches, breathing the fresh, cold, clear air for most of the day. And some people were on total rest. Once they were out of bed rest, they were on chair rest during the day. The famous, as well as the unknown, came in hope of recovery. Writer Robert Louis Stevenson came for a time in the 1880s, and a year after Kathleen Hammond, famed New York Giants pitcher Christy Mathewson. 5 years later, after a cycle of temporary improvements and relapses, Mathewson died in his spacious, custom-built Saranac cure cottage. Kathleen, like Mathewson, could afford the best of care. She initially stayed at the Santanoni Apartments near the center of town, a luxury apartment built around 1913 for tuberculosis patients, where her condition would have been assessed and treatment recommendations made. They were very well organized too. receive prospective patients in the whole town. She then rented what was later known as the Morgan Cottage. And it's an elegant little cobblestone and mortar bungalow at 100 Park Avenue, now 211 Park Avenue, not far from the gates of the Trudeau Sanatorium. A cottage built on spec only 3 years before, specially designed to serve the needs of tubercular patients. The Cure Cottage featured a call system, extra wide doors, and both glassed in and screened cure porches. Porches where a patient reclined on a chaise longue-like cure chair, breathing pure, unheated mountain air as part of the invalid regime. Kathleen, who was probably the first patient to occupy the cottage, was installed there under the care of Edna Carr, a private nurse. She had daily visits from Dr. Lawrence and Brown, who, after the death of Dr. Trudeau in 1915, Trudeau died of resurgent tuberculosis, was the best known and most respected physician in the village. Like Dr. Trudeau, Dr. Brown had first come to the Adirondacks to be treated himself for tuberculosis and had stayed on to minister to other sufferers, gaining a national reputation. And this is a photo of Dr. Brown with one of his patients, which I actually bought in an antique store in Sackett's Harbor. There was a little album, and you can see, you can see the charm of the man as well as the expertise. Kathleen's day would have been divided between bed rest and the cure chair. Patients as ill as she evidently was had very little of what was called up time. And one of the fascinating things about tuberculosis was the whole vocabulary that developed around it. Kathleen was praised for her jewels, I think many of which went down on a Titanic. But when she got to Saranac Lake, patients talked of jewel boxes. But the jewel boxes were little containers for their fluids, for things like sputum, because, of course, it couldn't be released or dropped into a wastebasket in a handkerchief because, of course, tuberculosis is infectious. So she was in a whole specialized world. Another patient about Kathleen's age, and there at about the same time, the American poet Adelaide Crapsey, who died in 1914, captured the Cure Cottage regimen in verse. This is from one of her poems. The text so weary in my ears, lie still and rest. Be patient and lie still and rest. Now, the fact that her Cure Cottage looked out on the local cemetery didn't help, actually. And the whole poem is addressed to the corpses in the cemetery. Even activities like letter writing were restricted. Let us hope that Kathleen could listen to her favorite musical review numbers on a Victrola, as a piano would undoubtedly have been off limits to her at this point. There is one surviving first-person account of Kathleen at this time. We are fortunate that decades later, Philip Gallo, a Saranac Lake architectural historian, interviewed Edna Carr, Kathleen Hammond's private nurse, about her memories of her patient. Both Carr and Dr. Brown were deeply touched by the plight of the beautiful, wealthy, young Lusitania war widow. And of course, this is another trope of 19th century womanhood, the beautiful, languishing invalid. So it was playing into a lot of veins, this scene. Gallo sums up their perceptions of their patient this way. Quote, the physical trial of the sinking had ruined her health. The loss of her husband had clouded her heart. Ill as she was, Kathleen was always, quote, soft-spoken, dignified, and proper. Nurse Carr recalled Dr. Brown's solicitude toward the 34-year-old invalid, noting that, quote, though physicians are not supposed to have favorites, he was always moved by her gentleness and her melancholy beauty. After every visit, he would say, isn't she lovely? Isn't she just lovely? Little wonder she was melancholy. Kathleen knew that she had little hope of recovery. Always elegantly turned out, she told her nurse, If I die, don't let anybody see me before I'm dressed and made up, or I'll haunt you. On the 23rd of August, she made her will. On the 22nd of September, 1919, Kathleen Hammond died of tuberculosis in the Morgan Cottage at Saranac Lake. Nurse Carr honored her patient's dying wish. When her brother arrived at the Morgan Cottage, Kathleen's body was so beautifully dressed and made up that her brother momentarily thought she was asleep. However, war and disease altered Kathleen Hammond's life. There is a positive sequel for her story that attests to her empathy and her nobility of character. A selflessness already evident in girlhood when she went to her uncle's rescue in the river waters off Gananoque. I find it's, in this symmetry you discover in lives when you look into them, this idea of her being hauled out of the water, exhausted when she was 13, and again after the Lusitania. In that Saranac will, Kathleen left the bulk of her very large estate to charity, quote, for the benefit of young war widows who were left widowed by the war and need help. Even in her last illness, she empathized with the widows who, like her, had suffered loss in war, but who, unlike her, were without means to cushion the blow. Eventually, an initial sum of $50,000, designated as the Hammond Fund, was directed to the Soldiers' Aid Commission, set up by the Ontario government in 1915 to help needy veterans and/or their families. After 1919, the Hammond Fund became, for a time, the largest source of income for the Commission, which was funded largely by bequests and donations. The Hammond Fund was substantially augmented in the 1930s when the estate's entitlement to funds from the estate of Kathleen's father-in-law was established by the Supreme Court of Canada. An unbelievably complicated legal case, the details of which I'll spare you. The Soldiers' Aid Commission still exists, giving grants to needy applicants, to spouses as well as veterans, to cover household expenses and medical and dental needs, among other things. At the beginning of this talk, I asked, what is the trajectory of a life? For Kathleen McParland Hammond, life's path had led her out of Kingston, initially in privilege, but also to tragedy and early death. Yet her sufferings evidently did not utterly break her spirit, as her generous last bequest reassures us. As her TB physician, Dr. Brown, put it, wasn't she just lovely? Yes, and courageous and noble as well. Thank you. Oh, and I might add, there's one kind of spooky sequel to all this, and that is, of course, I have said to you that Frederick Hammond's body was never recovered. Well, I started searching for Kathleen's gravesite, and I can't find her anywhere. Now, her obituary in the Whig says that she's going to be buried in Brockville, but according to the cemetery records, she's not there. Now, Duncan and I did a sortie to investigate, but of course there was 2.5 feet of snow in Brockville Cemetery. So perhaps she'll reveal herself in the summer, but in the meantime, I haven't been able to recover her body either. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. One of the joys of marriage is constantly being amazed by the potential reality of your spouse. And thank you for this, Sandy, very much. A very telling story. As always, we're very happy to take questions. We have a couple of special guests in a few minutes, just to round out the evening. But if you'd like to ask a question, either register on Zoom or just raise your hand here and I will bring the microphone to you so we can hear your question.
Curious, you said you traveled to this Lake Saranac.
Saranac Lake, yes.
Lake. So what is it like now?
Well, the question is, what is Saranac Lake like now? It's still a town of approximately the same size. And interestingly enough, when the AIDS epidemic was on, there was a greater acceptance or a greater accommodation in Saranac Lake to people with that illness, because people in Saranac Lake had historically for decades, generations, been used to looking after people in that sort of situation. Of course, it's in the center of the Adirondacks, which is a all year round resort and with the great camps. So it's basically a tourist place, but they're very proud of their tubercular history. And it's well worth visiting. Dr. Trudeau had a research laboratory for tuberculosis, which is now a museum run by Historic Saranac Lake. The library has a very good photo exhibit on the tuberculosis years. And as for the sanatoria itself, it closed in the early 1950s. Once the antibiotic that was so effective was developed, and it was bought by the American Management Association as a retreat. So you can't revisit the buildings, but you can drive through. The chapel is still there. One of the poignant things, another thing I bought in an antique store is I bought a postcard of the sanatorium from about 1920, and it was addressed and stamped. And the front had a photograph of the hospital. And I said to Duncan, well, this is peculiar. This has no message, until I turned it over and I looked at the photograph of the hospital, and up in the corner, someone had written, patient had written in tiny letters, why don't you? Why don't you write? So, you know, it's a very, very interesting place and very historic. And it's on the National Register of Historic Places in the United States.
I might mention, Sandy mentioned this in the talk some years ago.
It's a crossover, yeah.
These disasters, of course, bring so much of humanity together into one instance, the sinking of the Titanic. Some years ago, I wrote a book on Canada's largest corporation in South America, the Brazilian Traction Company, now known, or if those of you who are investors, as Brascan Limited, and now Brookfield, where, of course, Mr. Carney was the chairman of the board. Mm-hmm. Brazilian Traction was founded on the genius of a hydroelectric engineer from Massachusetts by the name of Fred Stark Pearson, a genius who brought hydroelectricity to Mexico, Spain, Brazil, and Canada, as well as the streets of New York. He was on the Lusitania. He drowned, as Sandy mentioned. His body was found some days later washed up on the shore of Ireland, and in his pocket was the sodden draft of the second annual report of the Brazilian Traction Company, which was subsequently published, and I'll pass this around, under his signature, en route SS Lusitania, May 1915. So this, has echoes into so many people's lives and corporate lives. Now we have a visitor here tonight, Sue Lawson, who I'll ask to come up because she has another personal connection to this tragedy. Sue is a recent resident to Kingston from Toronto. Sue, welcome.
Thank you. My first time with the mic. I have to say I'm delighted to live in Kingston, and thank you for your welcome tonight. So my grandmother, Doris Charles, was on the Lusitania, and she was 20. You can look her up online. There's all kinds of Google stuff. I've been doing that myself. Her father was the secretary treasurer of the Mousson Book Publishing Company. Mr. Mousson was ill and couldn't take the manuscripts over to England, so Mr. Charles was taking them in his stead. He took his daughter because she was engaged to Mr. Lawler, who she later married, and he thought that she was too young and that she should have a trip to Europe and think this over, even though the family had already allowed her to have the ring, and apparently there were people in the house making her clothes. So, you can sort of picture that era, right? It's quite a miracle, really, that she survived, because there was, as I said, no thrills, no life jacket trying on. She said she was interviewed by the CBC, sorry, I said BBC, but that was wrong, in 1965, and we all piled in a car. We lived in Sudbury then, and we listened through this crackly radio to this interview. It was the only time she ever spoke of the sinking. But my cousin got the transcript and wrote it up And so now we have a written copy, and she said, it's a lovely story, but it doesn't capture the emotion, the sadness, and the peace that she felt later. So her father didn't swim. She went down to pack that day at 2 o'clock. She felt the two hits she knew they were a torpedo, even though she'd never been warned that there was a torpedo. And so she rushed out of her stateroom wearing her engagement ring and no life jacket. And her father, knowing that she was going to pack, waited at the top of the stairs. I mean, it's amazing, right? So the two of them went up to the deck. They went to the high side because they didn't know where to go. Got in a lifeboat. Somebody released the rope, and the lifeboat up, like one end dropped. So it's now looking like a Christmas ornament hanging from the one rope. And everybody dumped out. And all the things in the boat dumped with them, on top of them, mostly. She got hit by a water keg in the back of her neck. And she always had kind of a thing like this, which no one ever asked her about for the rest of her life. So then she kept her father afloat somehow. They both had a life jacket. He had found two upstairs somehow. And doesn't say how long they were in the water, but she swam away to get a boat, and then realized she couldn't make it. And that exhausted her so much that she fell unconscious in the water. And then her father held her up. He was 48. And then, so they were finally rescued. And so by 12 o'clock that night, they still were wearing their wet clothes. They had no drinks of water. There was no, it was just fishermen taking them into some inn. They got to the inn and there was no water. There was no drinking water in the inn. I don't know how they survived. And a maid gave them some clothes. The father went out and found some pajamas somewhere. And then the next day, again, no water until they were on a train. Is it a train? I remember, yeah, train to somewhere in Ireland, and somebody gave them an orange. And she said how unbelievable this orange tasted because it was so fresh. And then the other funny thing is the father went out in the morning to buy them some clothes because their clothes were still sodden. And all she had left, she kicked off her petticoat and the various things in the water. So she only had her shirt and her skirt, which probably went to her ankles then, right? So he went out and bought some clothes so she lists the clothes. The first thing are the corsets, because they found a young girl who was 15 who'd lost her parents. And so they had her as well. So he bought clothes for these two. Imagine buying a corset now, in a shipwreck, right? And then they bought shoes, but he had the wrong size. So they bent the heel back so that they were walking on these shoes with the heel back, but at least they could, get to the train wearing something, right? So they survived, and she went on to marry my grandfather in September of the same year. It's amazing, really. And they had 4 kids, 3 of whom survived. My father was one, and here I am. And I have to say, we're all such proud swimmers. I made it such a priority to my kids to swim early and swim well. And we're all so proud when we can win a swimming race, thanks to my grandmother. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. One thing I might add is Sandy and I love going to Ireland. It's a wonderful country, as I think many of you know. And we were staying in Kinsale 2 years ago. And right across the street from us was an Anglican church, a Church of Ireland church, Anglican. In fact, the church where King Charles II was proclaimed before he went back to England after the Civil War. And we were there on the same day that Charles III became King of England. However, in the court, in the cemetery, there were 7 graves in a line at the back, all for victims of the Lusitania. 4 of them were named. 3 were still anonymous. All were inscribed with the words "murdered by the Germans on the Lusitania." What was striking on the 2 of the 4 unknown graves were little brass plaques now saying that thanks to DNA, the incumbent of the grave was now recognized to be the 29-year-old woman from Kansas City who was such a name. So they have found a name again. It was very poignant, especially the word "murdered," which captures, as Sandy said, the fervor of the time, the hatred against the Hun, etc. Sandy, I think, had one word of warning for travelers now about how the Cunard line treated its
some of you may be wondering about the question of compensation. You'll be happy to know that Cunard said, we will return your possessions if they've been recovered. And there was a very modest financial assistance, but they offered a 25% discount on any future travel with the line. I can recommend, John kindly loaned me Eric Larson's book on the Lusitania, and I'd read a previous one. There's several books on it, but meticulously researched. It was a joy to work with it. And of course, the World Wide Web, the Lusitania Resource, the website, the material's not always reliable. I mean, if you check it out, but it's exhaustive and fascinating. And of course, there are people who've made it their hobby to track down everything they possibly can about passengers, especially first class passengers, because they have that mystique. And the one disappointment I had in Larson's book was he talks about Ogden Hammond and the mix-up between the couples, and he says, but it was the other Mrs. Hammond who survived, and that's all he says about her. And I went, no, that's Kathleen. You need to say more. So, yes.
Doris said that they paid reparations, Cunard paid reparations in 1929.
Yes, there was a delay because there was an investigation for liability and assignment. Larson's quite good at talking about that and gives you an account. And of course, there's a whole body of thought that says, well, the British deliberately didn't protect the Lusitania because they knew how provocative it would be if anything happened to her. So there's a whole sort of dark body of thought surrounding the Lusitania. But then you can see the unbelievable complacency. No lifeboat drill, no life jackets, a drill. And this is 3 years after the Titanic, which received massive publicity. Now, that was a different shipping line. That was White Star. But you would have thought that would have been. Yes?
Your grandmother's father had money to buy clothes. Like he said, how many hours in the water?
The question to Sue was, how did her grandfather have money to buy clothes after the tragedy?
He didn't. I think he had some gold coins in his pocket, which he thoughtfully decided to keep. But apparently, Cunard somehow paid something. So the I don't know how this all worked. They must have paid the shopkeepers. That detail sort of isn't in there, but they didn't have to pay anything. Yeah. I know, it's unbelievable, right? There was no, like, everybody's in shock and everything, but no one's thinking about that, and they must have been scattered all over the place. The other thing she said, it was interesting, was that no one was yelling and screaming, that everybody was totally calm and everybody was focused on what they needed to do. And in fact, in the water, this really touched me. She had been in Anglican church in the choir, and she started to sing that song. How does it go? I can't remember. She sang the song anyway, and she said she could hear others singing as they're floating around on these rafts.
Yeah.
And one more detail I forgot about. They were first class, so she passed this room. It was a big room like this, and she said the playpen almost filled the room. All the children would be left in this room to play. So at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they were probably either sleeping or playing there. And the parents are separated now from the children. So most of the children were lost, I think, right?
Yeah.
And it was an older crew because, of course, it was expensive to go. So there were very few young people on that. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. So many anecdotes about this, but Sandy tells me also that after leaving New York, they discovered German stowaways on the ship who were put in the brig and, of course, met their fate at the hands of their own compatriots. So I would like to call on Peter Gower to thank our speaker.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I'll just add one story to what happened to the survivors. The person whom I've followed most closely after the shipwreck went on to Birmingham, where his wife had originally lived with his 3 children. And after a day in Birmingham, whatever then was the Children's Aid Society came and took the children away from them because they pointed out they had no money and they could not buy any clothes or any food for the children. So the society would look after, and they better look after themselves. So yeah, it was a tough time. If you lost all your money, you had to find your way out somewhere. Sandy, what a fantastic evening. And I'm so glad you've got the people here who can add to it. A very, very personal talk on somebody who, a Kingston resident who had no idea what the rest of her life would be, shipwrecked, and then spending time in that resort. On behalf of the society, thank you very much. I hope you'll accept this.
Oh, I will. It's an
You will. Oh, yeah, that's right. You can now buy clothes after your shipwreck, you see. Anyway, thank you so much for that. Sue, thank you for your addition as well. And I'm going to talk with you afterwards, just briefly, if I can. Just a couple of comments then. A reminder, the booklet, if anybody wants a copy, email me at the Society website. Next month, again, a female, thank goodness, as the topic. Christine Leverley at St. Lawrence College is going to talk about her research into the pioneering 19th century Canadian author Julia Beckwith Hart, who wrote a novel, St. Ursula's Convent, probably one of the first novels that was written in Canada, and certainly one of the first examples of an Indigenous novel here. So we look forward to that. That'll be May the 21st. And on June the 6th, we have our annual commemoration of the life of Sir John A. Macdonald. It will, we hope, be held in the cemetery. We always hope that. And then when it rains in the morning, we have to move. The speaker this year will be Roy McSkimming, and we will give details to members and to everybody else who is welcome. That'll be 1:30 on the afternoon of June the 6th. And if you get to Cataraqui Cemetery, it's well signed as to where to go. So again, thank you, Sandy. Thank you, 35 of you here. Is it 35, Paul? Did you count? I counted it once. Yeah, 40. Wonderful, 40.
Got 15 online.
And plus the people at home on Zoom. Thank you all so much for coming. For those of you who have to travel home, have a safe trip home. Thank you.